The wagon wheels screamed against the dry Texas earth as the driver whipped the horses into a desperate gallop, dust billowing in great orange clouds behind the retreating vehicle. Inside, Rosa Vane clutched the wooden seat with both hands, her knuckles white, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The trunk strapped to the back of the wagon held everything she owned, everything she had managed to salvage from a life that had collapsed around her like a burning building. She was leaving. She had to leave. There was no other option left. Then the road disappeared. Not literally, but the massive chestnut horse that stepped directly into the path of the wagon at the edge of Caldwell, Texas, might as well have swallowed the road whole. The driver hauled back on the reins with a curse, the horses shrieking and rearing, and the wagon lurched sideways before grinding to a halt in a cloud of choking dust. Rosa's breath froze in her chest. Standing in the middle of the road, broad-shouldered and immovable as the stone bluffs that framed the horizon, was a man she had been doing her best to avoid for 3 weeks. Ranger Flynn Bartlett. His badge caught the late afternoon sun and threw a sharp glint of light directly into her eyes. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the wagon with those steady dark eyes, and then he looked at her through the canvas opening, and something in his expression made the air between them feel like the moment before lightning strikes. "Step off the wagon, Miss Vane," he said. His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need to shout to be obeyed. She did not move. Behind the wagon, she could already hear the boots of Silas Drummond's hired men approaching from the direction of town, their spurs ringing against the packed earth. She had timed her escape for the gap between their patrol shifts. She had been so careful. She had been so certain. Flynn Bartlett turned slightly, just enough to address the men rushing up behind the wagon. 3 of them, with the hard, flat faces of men paid to hurt people and not lose sleep over it. His hand rested near his holster, loose and casual, but there was nothing casual about the stillness in his body. "She is not leaving this town," he said. The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Not a threat, not a plea. An absolute declaration of fact, spoken by a man who had clearly already decided how this moment was going to end, and was merely informing everyone else of the outcome. Rosa felt something crack open inside her chest, and she could not tell if it was terror or something far more dangerous than that. 3 weeks earlier, Rosa Vane had arrived in Caldwell, Texas, with a carpetbag, a letter of introduction, and the cautious optimism of a woman who had spent the better part of her 24 years learning to survive in situations that most people would not have chosen to walk into. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell was a cattle town, one of the last real stops on the Kishome Trail before the drives pushed north. It smelled of livestock, leather, and the particular brand of ambition that arrives when men realize there is money to be made from the movement of animals across open land. Rosa had been hired to serve as a bookkeeper for a man named Silas Drummond, who owned the largest livestock operation in that part of Comanche County. The letter of introduction had come through a placement agency in San Antonio, and the position had seemed legitimate. Honest work for a woman who had a genuine talent for numbers and an even more genuine need for income. Her father had died 6 months prior, leaving behind nothing but debts and a small house that was seized before she had finished grieving. She had sold her mother's silver hairbrush to buy her train ticket north. She had arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Caldwell had struck her as the kind of town that was just barely held together by routine, and the mutual understanding that chaos was always one bad decision away. There was a main street with a general store, a hotel, a post office, a barber shop, a saloon that never quite seemed to close, and a small jailhouse at the far end of the street that sat beneath a sign reading Texas Rangers, Caldwell Station. The surrounding land was flat and enormous, all yellowed grass and sky, with the horizon so far away it felt like a philosophical concept rather than a geographical one. Drummond's office was attached to the south end of the stockyards, and Silas Drummond himself was waiting when she arrived. A large man in his mid-40s with a handsome face that had been made calculating by money, and the habit of getting what he wanted. He had shaken her hand with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that charm was cheaper than paying people properly, and he had shown her to a small room above the dry goods store on Main Street that would serve as her accommodation. The work itself had begun simply enough. Ledgers, livestock counts, payments to drovers and suppliers. Rosa was good at numbers in the way that certain people are good at languages. She did not merely understand them, she felt them, the rhythm and logic of columns adding up to truth or to lies. And it did not take her long to realize that Silas Drummond's books contained both in abundance. The discrepancy was not obvious. Drummond was not a stupid man. He had layered his deceptions carefully, shifting small amounts between accounts, recording sales under alternate names, creating the appearance of legitimate operating losses that explained away the movement of money that should not have been moving. But Rosa had been trained by her father, who had worked as an accountant in Houston before his health collapsed, and her father had believed in doing things precisely and correctly, and he had passed that precision on to his daughter like a gift wrapped in discipline. Within 10 days of her arrival, Rosa knew that Silas Drummond was stealing from the cattle operations of every small rancher in the surrounding territory who used his stockyards as a transit point. He was skimming from the sale prices, adjusting weights and pocketing the difference. It was not a violent crime, but it was a ruinous one, the kind of slow theft that drained families over seasons and years and left them wondering why they could never quite get ahead no matter how hard they worked. She had not gone to the Rangers immediately. She had been afraid. She had copied the relevant ledger pages into her own private notebook, working late at night by lamplight after Drummond and his clerks had gone home, her hands shaking slightly with the awareness that what she was doing could get her killed if anyone noticed. She had told herself she was gathering sufficient evidence. In truth, she was gathering courage. The day she had finally decided to go to the jailhouse at the end of the street, she had stepped out of the dry goods store into the morning sun and nearly collided with the man coming up the stairs. Flynn Bartlett had reflexes that were almost unsettling in their speed. He caught her by both shoulders before she could fall backward down the steps, and for a moment they were standing very close together on the narrow landing, Rosa looking up and Flynn looking down, and neither of them saying anything. He was 30 years old, she would learn that later. Tall, lean in the particular way of men who spent most of their lives on horseback, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of good coffee. He wore the silver star of a Texas Ranger on his chest, and there was something in his face that she recognized without being able to name immediately, something that would take her days to identify as the particular expression of a person who has seen a great deal of the world's worst behavior and has chosen, despite all evidence against it, to still believe that decency is worth defending. "Pardon me," she had said, stepping back. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," he had replied, and his voice was exactly as she would later describe it. Low and measured, with a quality of stillness in it that suggested he had trained himself out of whatever urgency he might once have felt. He had glanced at the notebook in her hands just briefly, not pointedly, and then he had looked back at her face. "You're Drummond's new bookkeeper. Rosa Vane. You know who I am." "It's a small town," he had said. "I know everyone. It's my job." But there had been something in the way he said it that suggested it was more than just his job. She had almost told him everything right then. Standing on those stairs with the morning sun warm on her back, and this quiet, watchful man looking at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than she was saying. She had almost opened the notebook and laid out every page of copied figures and said, "This man is robbing people, and I have the proof." Instead, she had said, "Good day, Ranger," and walked past him down the street because she was still afraid, and fear makes even the bravest people cautious. She had gone back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about what she was doing with the particular clarity that comes from moments of near action. She thought about Silas Drummond, who had smiled at her so pleasantly, and who had a man named Cutter, a thick-necked, cold-eyed enforcer who followed him everywhere. She thought about what happened to people who made enemies of powerful men in small towns where everyone knew everyone and the nearest federal courthouse was days away. She thought about her father, who had taught her precision and honesty, and she thought about what he would say. She knew what he would say. She spent the next several days moving very carefully, continuing her work as normal, completing the ledgers that Drummond assigned her, speaking to him in the pleasant professional tones of a woman who had noticed nothing unusual. But she had also quietly begun to document more. Dates, names, specific transactions. She found a second set of records, a handwritten journal that Drummond kept in the locked bottom drawer of his desk, by the accident of discovering that the key on his watch chain also fit that drawer when he left it lying on the desk during a midday meal. She had not taken the journal. Instead, she had spent 40 minutes copying its most significant entries into her notebook, and then locked the drawer again and returned the keychain to exactly the position she had found it. By the end of her second week, she had enough evidence to bury Drummond. She had also, in the small daily movements of a person living in a small town, begun to develop an involuntary awareness of Flynn Bartlett that she found deeply inconvenient. It was not that she sought him out. It was that Caldwell was genuinely small, and the ranger's daily rounds brought him past the bookkeeping office at the stockyards twice a day, and he always acknowledged her when he passed the window. Just a slight nod, unhurried, as if they had an established understanding that neither of them had articulated. She had taken to sitting slightly back from the window to avoid appearing to watch for him, which meant she was watching for him from slightly further back, which was no improvement at all. She had learned things about him in the small-town manner, through conversation fragments, overheard exchanges, the way people spoke his name. He had been a ranger for 6 years, assigned to Caldwell 2 years ago when the cattle trade had started bringing with it the associated problems of cattle theft, fraudulent sale practices, and occasional violence. He was from a town near San Marcos originally. He had a reputation for thoroughness, and a particular dislike of men who used their economic power to take advantage of people who had fewer options. He was unmarried. He was 20 years of age in honesty that felt older than 30, and 30 in age that felt younger than the weariness behind his eyes. She told herself that none of this was relevant. She was gathering evidence against a criminal, and when she had enough, she would take it to the appropriate authority, and then she would leave Caldwell and find another position somewhere else, and continue the careful, solitary business of surviving her life. She had not expected to accidentally walk into the middle of something much larger than what she had found. It was on the 17th day of her employment that she overheard the conversation that changed everything. She had gone back to the stockyard office after dark to retrieve her own notebook, which she had absent-mindedly left in her desk drawer, and the building was supposed to be empty. The night drovers were with the cattle, and Drummond's clerks had all gone home. But as she approached the rear door, she heard voices from inside, and she stopped. Drummond's voice. And then another man's voice, one she did not recognize immediately, but which had the distinctive flat vowels of someone from further east. They were talking about a land purchase. A very large land purchase. Specifically, the purchase of the Riley family's homestead, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land to the west of town, which had been in the Riley family for 20 years, and which the Rileys had absolutely no intention of selling. "The debts are real," Drummond was saying. "We've been managing the numbers on their sales for 2 seasons. They think they've had 2 bad years because of weather and bad luck. They don't know what's been done to their accounts. By the end of summer, they'll be financially destroyed. Then we offer pennies and they'll have no choice but to take them." "And what about the woman?" said the other voice. There was a pause. Rosa stood utterly still in the darkness outside the door, her hand pressed flat against the wooden wall. "The bookkeeper. She's been here 3 weeks. She keeps her head down, does her work, doesn't ask questions." Another pause. "I don't think she's seen anything useful. She's seen the ledgers. I keep the real records separate. She's only seen the clean versions. Besides, even if she had seen something, what would she do? She's a woman alone in a town where I own half the buildings. She has nowhere to go and no one to tell." Rosa stood in the darkness for a long time after the voices fell silent, and the 2 men eventually left through the front door. She waited until she could no longer hear their footsteps. Then she went inside, retrieved her notebook, and walked back to her room above the dry goods store. She sat at her small desk and thought about the Riley family. She had seen them twice, she realized, had served them coffee in passing at the hotel when she had been eating breakfast there one morning. A couple in their 50s, weathered and solid in the way of people who had built something with their own hands. 3 adult children. 2 of the grown children had spouses and small children of their own. All of it at risk because of a man who believed that having power meant being free to use it however he chose. She thought about Drummond saying, "She has nowhere to go and no one to tell." She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began writing a formal statement. The next morning, she had walked to the jailhouse at the end of the street and asked to speak with the ranger in private. Flynn Bartlett had been at his desk, writing a report, and he had looked up when she entered, and something in his expression had shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that a careful person shifts when they register that something important is about to happen. "Miss Vane," he had said. "Sit down." She had sat down. She had laid her notebook open on the desk between them, and she had told him everything. He had not interrupted her, not once. He had read every page she indicated, carefully, and when she was finished talking he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had looked at her with an expression that was equal parts professional respect and something else she had not been prepared for. "How long have you been sitting on this?" he had asked. 17 days, she had said. "That was a significant risk to carry alone. I needed to be certain before I came to you. I needed to have enough that it couldn't be dismissed." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, quietly and with what felt like genuine honesty, "You're a very brave woman, Miss Vane." She had not known what to do with that. She had busied herself with closing her notebook. "What happens now?" she had asked. "Now I begin building an official case," he had said. "I need to get a message to the circuit judge in Wichita Falls. We'll need a warrant before I can act, and the wire will take several days. In the meantime, I need you to continue as normal at the office. Can you do that?" "Yes," she had said, although her stomach had tightened at the thought. "And I need you to not speak of this to anyone. Not the hotel keeper, not the store owner, not anyone. Can you do that?" "I understand discretion," she had said, slightly sharply, and he had looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I don't doubt it," he had said. She had left the jailhouse feeling lighter than she had in weeks, and terrified in an entirely new way that had nothing to do with Silas Drummond. The following days had been both the most professionally tense and personally disorienting of her life. She had continued her work at Drummond's office with a composure that exhausted her. She had eaten her meals at the hotel, walked Main Street in the mornings, done everything that Rosa Vane, the ordinary bookkeeper, would normally do. And twice a day, Flynn Bartlett had walked past the stockyard office window, and twice a day she had been aware of him in a way that she was running out of logical explanations for. They had spoken, officially, twice more, both times in his office, both times formally, both times about the case. He had told her the wire to the circuit judge had been sent. He had told her the judge's response had confirmed that a warrant was being prepared. He had told her it would take approximately 5 more days. What they had also done, in the spaces between the official business, was talk. Not at length, not about anything significant on the surface, but she had found herself telling him about her father, about growing up in Houston, about the particular loneliness of being good at a skill, numbers, that most people expected only men to have. And he had told her, with the same quiet frankness that seemed to be his natural register, about his own family in San Marcos, about the younger brother he had helped raise after their mother died, about why he had become a ranger rather than a rancher like his father had wanted. "You wanted to fix things," she had said during one of these conversations. He had considered that for a moment. "I wanted to make sure the people who couldn't protect themselves had someone who would." She had looked at him very carefully when he said that. He had been looking at the surface of his desk, turning his pen between his fingers, and there had been nothing performative in the statement, no posturing, no desire to impress. He had simply stated a fact about himself the way she stated facts about numbers, because it was true, and there was no particular point in pretending otherwise. She had gone back to her room that evening and sat for a long time at her window, looking at the darkening street below, and she had made herself think very clearly about several things. She was in a dangerous situation in a small town controlled by a powerful man who would not respond well to exposure. The warrant was days away. She needed to be careful. She needed to stay focused. She absolutely, categorically, could not afford the luxury of developing feelings for the Texas Ranger who was helping her, because doing so would compromise her focus, and compromising her focus in her current circumstances was a form of suicide. She had thought all of this very clearly and very logically, and had arrived at the neat, rational conclusion that Flynn Bartlett was simply a man doing his job, and she was simply a woman doing the right thing, and that was the full extent of what was happening between them. Then she had gone to bed and dreamed about his hands. The crisis came on the 21st day. She had arrived at the stockyard office that morning to find Drummond already there, which was unusual. He typically did not arrive until mid-morning. He was standing at her desk. He was holding her notebook. The world went very still. Rosa stood in the doorway and did not run, because there was nowhere to run to, and because Cutter, Drummond's enforcer, was standing beside the filing cabinet with his arms crossed and his eyes on her face. She took a breath. She walked into the room. "You've been busy," Drummond said. His pleasant voice had dropped away and left something colder behind it. He flipped through the pages of her notebook with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted her to understand the full weight of what was happening. "That's my private property," she said, Not anymore. He closed it. You're very thorough, Miss Vane. Your father taught you well. He said her father the way a man says something he has already looked into, and her blood went cold. What do you want? She said. I want you to leave Caldwell, he said. Today, on the next available coach. I want you to take whatever you have in your room and go back to wherever you came from. And I want you to understand very clearly that if any version of what you think you found here reaches any official ear, I will know it was you, and I will make certain that you deeply regret it. He set the notebook down on the desk between them. I'm being generous. I'm giving you the opportunity to walk away. You should take it. She had looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the Riley family. She thought about every rancher whose accounts had been quietly drained. She thought about her father, who had been precise and honest and had taught her that both of those things mattered. I'll need until this afternoon to gather my things, she had said. He had nodded, satisfied, and gestured for Cutter to step aside. She had gone back to her room. She had not packed. Instead, she had sat at her desk and written out from memory every figure, every date, every name from her notebook, all of it, the entire case, reconstructed on fresh pages. It took her 2 hours. Her hand cramped twice. She did not stop. Then she had gone to the jailhouse, and Flynn Bartlett had not been there. A note on the door said he was out on the Northern Patrol Road. She had left the new pages in a sealed envelope on his desk with his name on it. And then, because she was not certain that the envelope would not be intercepted, she had done the one other thing she could think of. She had written out a summary of the key facts on a second piece of paper, folded it very small, and tucked it into the lining of her boot. Then she had gone back to her room, packed her trunk, and arranged passage on the afternoon coach to Wichita Falls. She had told herself she was being practical. The warrant was still days away. She did not have her notebook. She had left the evidence with Flynn. The best thing she could do was get out of Drummond's reach and wait for the legal process to work. She had also told herself, very firmly, that the weight in her chest as she climbed onto the coach had nothing to do with leaving behind a dark-eyed Texas Ranger who had called her brave. She had almost believed herself. And then Flynn Bartlett had ridden his chestnut horse into the middle of the road, and she had looked through the canvas opening at his face, and he had said those 4 words with that particular absolute certainty. And every rational argument she had made to herself in the last 2 hours had scattered like dust. She is not leaving this town. Step off the wagon, Miss Vane, he said again, and his eyes were on her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the professional steadiness of a ranger conducting an investigation, not the careful courtesy of a man keeping his personal thoughts appropriately separated from his professional obligations. Something else. Something raw and direct that he was not, for once, controlling. Behind the wagon, Drummond's 3 hired men had stopped moving when they saw the ranger's hand near his holster. Cutter was among them. They were calculating distances and odds with the practiced efficiency of men who did that kind of calculation regularly. Rosa looked at Flynn. She looked at the road ahead, empty, stretching away into the flat Texas afternoon with the promise of escape. She looked back at Flynn. She stepped off the wagon. She did it without entirely understanding why, because the rational part of her brain was still listing the reasons that leaving was the correct choice. But the part of her that had been paying attention to things it shouldn't for 3 weeks had already made the decision before her foot touched the ground. Flynn moved his horse to the side of the road without taking his eyes off Drummond's men. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stood between Rosa and the 3 men with the immovable patience of a man who has staked out a position and has no intention of abandoning it. Miss Vane is required to remain in Caldwell as a material witness in an ongoing ranger investigation, he said, in that same quiet, carrying voice. Any individual who attempts to interfere with that status is obstructing Texas Rangers in the performance of their lawful duties. That is a serious offense. He looked directly at Cutter. You know what kind of offense, Cutter? Cutter stared at him with those flat, cold eyes for a long moment. Then he looked at the badge. Then he looked at the two men beside him. And whatever calculation he ran through his head in that moment came out against taking on a Texas Ranger with the sun still up and half the town presumably watching from the street behind them. He said nothing. He turned and walked back toward the stockyards. The other two men followed without a word. Rosa stood in the road with her skirts dusty, and her heart hammering, and the afternoon light making everything look slightly unreal. Flynn dismounted and stood beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "The envelope I left on your desk," she said finally. "I have it," he said. "I've already sent a second wire to the circuit judge. I received confirmation 2 hours ago that the warrant has been issued. I'm sending for a deputy marshal from Wichita Falls tomorrow morning. Then it's over. It's almost over." He paused. "It won't be finished quickly enough for Drummond not to cause problems between now and when the marshal arrives, which is why I need you here where I can." He stopped. He seemed to make a decision. "Where I can ensure your safety," he finished. She looked at him. "That's not all of what you were going to say." He met her eyes. "No," he said. "It isn't." She waited. "I also need you here," he said, "because you walked into my office 3 weeks ago and laid out the most careful, thorough, precise piece of evidence documentation I've seen from a trained law officer, let alone from a woman doing it alone in hostile circumstances. And I have been trying to find the appropriate professional distance from that fact ever since, and I am not entirely succeeding." The afternoon was very quiet around them. The dust from the wagon had settled. In the distance, a cow somewhere in the stockyards made a long carrying sound. "You have terrible timing," Rosa said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at her trunk, still strapped to the back of the stationary wagon. Then she looked back at his face, at the careful honesty in it, at the way he was watching her with those steady dark eyes and making absolutely no move to come closer. Simply standing there, giving her the choice, making it entirely clear that whatever she decided, it would be her decision. "My room is paid until the end of the week," she said. Something in his face shifted just slightly, just around the eyes. "I'm aware," he said. "Then I suppose," she said, "I will need to make other arrangements for after Friday." She turned and walked back toward Main Street. She heard him follow, leading his horse, a few paces behind. And she permitted herself, just briefly, the private luxury of a smile that she was very careful to keep facing forward. The next 3 days were simultaneously the most professionally dangerous and the most personally charged of Rosa's life, and she navigated them with the particular focus of a woman who had been doing difficult things in difficult circumstances for long enough that she had developed a working relationship with controlled fear. Drummond did not send Cutter after her again. He was not stupid enough to make a direct physical move against her now that the Ranger had publicly claimed her as a protected witness. Whatever else could be said about Silas Drummond, he understood that attacking a witness under Ranger protection would bring federal attention down on him far faster than any accounting discrepancy. Instead, he applied pressure in the quieter, more sophisticated ways available to a man who effectively owned much of the local economy. The hotel informed her, with considerable apology, that her room was no longer available. The dry goods store suddenly discovered that they could not continue to hold her room above the shop. The restaurant on the east end of Main Street twice managed to not have her food order ready, both times citing kitchen difficulties that did not seem to affect anyone else. Flynn watched this happening and said nothing for approximately 1 day, until the hotel situation came to a head, and Rosa emerged from the lobby with her trunk and stood on the boardwalk with the specific expression of a woman who is exercising tremendous restraint and will shortly run out of it. He had been across the street. He had seen her come out. He crossed the street and he said, without preamble, "There's a room above the jailhouse. It was used as a witness-holding room. It's clean. You'd have your own lock." "I'm not sleeping in a jail," she said. "It's above the jail," he said. The distinction is meaningful. Flynn. She had used his first name without planning to. She saw him register it, just a slight shift in his expression, a very small thing, as if a door had opened a precise inch. It was the first time she had used it. "Rosa," he said, and her name in his voice was something she felt rather than heard. "It's the safest place in this town right now, and it's available, and Drummond can't touch it, and I would very much like you to not be standing on the street with your trunk in 2 days before the marshal arrives." She looked at him. She looked at her trunk. She looked at the hotel, behind whose front window she could see the desk clerk watching them with Drummond-adjacent interest. "Show me the room," she said. It was adequate. A single bed, a washstand, a small window overlooking the alley behind the jailhouse, and a solid lock that responded well to its key. Flynn carried her trunk up the narrow stairs with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had decided not to make a performance of the gesture, and then he stood at the top of the stairs while she inspected the space. "It's fine," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll be downstairs." "Come down if you need anything." He started back down the stairs. "Flynn," she said. He stopped. "Why did you ride out to stop the coach? Not the official reason, the real one." He was still for a moment with his back to her, one hand on the stair railing. Then he turned, and she saw, for the first time, something unguarded in his face, something that had been very carefully managed for 3 weeks, suddenly choosing not to be managed anymore. "Because when you walked into my office 3 weeks ago," he said, "I was halfway through a telegraph report that I had been staring at for an hour without taking in a single word of, because all I could think about was the woman on the stairs that morning who looked at me with those eyes and had a notebook in her hands and walked away before I could find a reason to make her stay." He paused. "And I thought about that envelope you left on my desk, and about a woman who would reconstruct her entire evidence base from memory in 2 hours, because she believed the right thing was worth doing even when it was costing her everything, and I got on my horse." The room was very quiet. "That," Rosa said carefully, "is a great deal to say on a staircase." "I'm aware," he said. "I told you my timing was bad." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back up," she said. He came back up the stairs. He stood in the doorway of the small room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she said, very directly, "I am not a woman who does things halfway, Flynn. If you're saying what I think you're saying, I need you to understand that. I don't do things by degrees." "Neither do I," he said. "Normally. You're a recent development in my life that has significantly disrupted my usual approach." She laughed. It was a small, genuine laugh, not the careful social expression she had been deploying for 3 weeks, and he looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she had to look away. "We have 2 days until the marshal arrives," she said. "And a criminal who is actively trying to make my life difficult. Perhaps we should resolve the immediate situation before we have any further conversations on staircases." "Agreed," he said. "Although for what it's worth, I intend to have this conversation again at the earliest appropriate opportunity." "I'm counting on it," she said, and did not look at him when she said it, but she heard his footsteps pause briefly on the stairs before continuing down. The following morning brought a development that none of them had anticipated. Drummond moved faster than expected. Rosa was up before dawn, unable to sleep, sitting at the small window of her room above the jailhouse when she saw the movement in the alley below. Two men, moving quietly, carrying what was unmistakably a large metal container. She recognized the smell even before she registered what she was seeing. Lamp oil. She was on the stairs before she had finished thinking it through, pounding on the door at the bottom with her fist. Flynn. He came awake fast. She heard him moving before the second knock, and the door opened with him in it, pulling on his shirt, reading her face with those sharp eyes in approximately 2 seconds. "Behind," she said. "Alley, lamp oil." He was past her and through the back door in 30 seconds, and she heard voices, sharp, clipped, and then the sound of someone running, and then Flynn's voice saying something firm and controlled. She stood at the back door and watched him escort one of the two men back inside by the collar. The other had apparently run faster than anticipated. He brought the man into the jailhouse and locked him in the cell that occupied the back half of the ground floor, and then he came back to where Rosa was standing with her arms crossed and her face very carefully controlled. "Arson attempt," he said. "That's a significantly more serious charge than accounting fraud. Drummond just made this worse for himself." "He's panicking," Rosa said. "He knows the warrant is coming. He's trying to cover his tracks by destroying the building where the records were kept. And possibly the witness who could identify those records from memory." She absorbed that. "I noticed," she said quietly. Flynn looked at her, and there was something in his face then that was more than professional concern, something tight and controlled and barely managed. He crossed to his desk and picked up his hat. "I need to go have a direct conversation with Silas Drummond," he said. "Flynn, I'll be fine." "I wasn't asking about fine," she said. "I was going to say be careful, not because I doubt you, because—" She stopped. She was not typically a woman who stumbled over words. He looked at her. He understood what she had stopped herself from finishing. He put on his hat. "I will," he said. And then, with the slight, deliberate care of a man making a considered choice, he crossed back to where she stood by the door and reached out and touched her hand, just briefly, just for a moment, just the press of his fingers around hers. "I'll be back in an hour." He went out the front door. She stood there with her hand still warm from his touch, and she thought, with some exasperation directed entirely at herself, that controlled fear had an entirely new definition now. The conversation Flynn had with Drummond was something Rosa did not witness directly, but she heard about it from 3 different people before noon, because Caldwell was that kind of town. Flynn had walked into Drummond's office at the stockyards and laid out, with his characteristic quiet precision, the exact nature of the legal situation. The warrant that was hours away. The man currently in the cell behind the jailhouse who would almost certainly cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. And the strong recommendation that Drummond seriously consider whether any further actions against a protected witness would be in his interest. He had not threatened. He had not raised his voice. He had stated facts. Drummond had apparently sat very still through this presentation and then asked Flynn to leave his property. Flynn had done so. Whether it was the specificity of the legal situation or the awareness that he had already overplayed his hand with the arson attempt, Drummond seemed to calculate that further direct action was more dangerous than controlled waiting. The social pressures on Rosa eased slightly, not completely, but enough that she could eat a meal at the restaurant on the east side of Main Street without her order going mysteriously missing. Flynn came back to the jailhouse within the hour he had promised, and Rosa was at the small table on the ground floor where she had been reading, and she looked up when he came in, and some of the tension she had been holding for the past hour, released in a slow exhale that she did not entirely succeed in hiding. "An hour," she said. "Exactly an hour," he confirmed, hanging up his hat. He sat down across from her, and he looked tired in a way she had not seen before. Not physically, but in the particular way of a person who has been holding something at bay for a while and is beginning to feel the effort of it. "What happens when this is over?" she asked. She had not planned to ask it. She had been asking it herself for 2 days. He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to happen? I asked you first." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands on the table. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because I need a witness. Not because the case isn't closed yet. Because Caldwell is significantly less interesting than it was 3 weeks ago, and—" he paused. "And because I have been trying for some time to figure out how to say that what I feel for you is not a professional circumstance. And I find that the most direct approach is the one that suits me best." She looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to stay in a town where a man I helped put in jail owns half the buildings, and the entire social establishment has been taught to be hostile to me." "I want you to stay," he said. "I'm aware that comes with context. It comes with significant context, Flynn." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to make it easy. I'm asking you to make it with me." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the most deliberate thing she had done in 3 weeks, more deliberate than copying the ledgers, more deliberate than walking to the jailhouse, more deliberate than stepping off the coach. She did it with the full knowledge of what it meant. He turned his hand over under hers. His fingers closed around her hand with a careful, encompassing warmth. They sat there for a long time without either of them saying anything more. The deputy marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding in from Wichita Falls with 2 additional men, and a set of writs that covered the full scope of the Drummond investigation. His name was Marshal Haynes, a solid, efficient man in his late 40s who read through Flynn's documentation with the focused speed of someone who had seen a lot of cases and could identify a well-built one on sight. "This is thorough work," he said, looking up at Flynn and then at Rosa, who was sitting beside Flynn's desk. "Both of you. This is a solid case." Silas Drummond was arrested at his office at the stockyards at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. Cutter was arrested at the same time, as were 2 clerks who had been knowingly maintaining the false records. The man in the cell at the jailhouse had cooperated fully, exactly as Flynn had predicted. Rosa stood on the boardwalk outside the jailhouse and watched the arrested men being walked down Main Street toward the waiting transport, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief, but a deep, quiet exhaustion that was very close to grief. She was not grieving Drummond. She was grieving the version of herself that had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks ago with a carpet bag and a letter of introduction. And the idea that honest work was straightforward. Flynn came and stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the same thing she was looking at. "The Rileys will get their land back," he said eventually. "The financial damages will be assessed as part of the recovery proceedings. It'll take time, but the families he took from will be compensated." She nodded. "Good," she said. And she meant it absolutely. "That's what matters." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I will be," she said. She turned to look at him, and there was enough morning light for her to see him clearly. The way he was watching her with that particular expression she had come to recognize as the one he reserved for moments of genuine feeling. "Can we take a walk?" she said. "Away from the street. Somewhere that isn't surrounded by the entire town watching." He nodded. He had left his hat on his desk, she noticed. They walked south out of town along the fence line of the stockyards, past the point where the buildings ended, and the flat Texas land opened up in its vast, indifferent way, all bleached grass and enormous sky. The morning was warm but not yet hot, and there was a wind coming in from the west that smelled of dry grass and the distant possibility of rain. Rosa walked with her hands free at her sides for the first time in weeks, and she felt the absence of the constant vigilance like a physical lightening. Flynn walked beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. "About staying," he listened. "I want to tell you that I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I want that to be clear. I could go back to San Antonio. I could find another position. I'm good at what I do, and I have references that exist in a world entirely separate from Sela's Drummond." "I know that," he said. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I know you weren't. I'm saying it for my own clarity." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "I'm staying because I want to. Because I have thought about it carefully, and I have come to the conclusion that wanting to stay is actually sufficient reason to stay. And I am done with making every decision about what I do based on what is pragmatically safest." Flynn was quiet beside her. She could feel him listening with his whole attention. "I would also like you to say the rest of what you said last night on the staircase," she said. "The part where you said that you had been trying to find appropriate professional distance and were not succeeding. I think you should finish that thought." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and they were standing in the middle of a field about a mile south of Caldwell in the clear Texas morning, with the wind moving through the grass around them and nobody in the world watching. "I have spent 6 years," Flynn said, "being very good at my job and very careful about the difference between my professional obligations and my personal feelings, because in my profession, those two things being confused tends to end badly for everyone. And then you walked up the stairs of the dry goods store and I nearly knocked you down, and you looked at me with those direct eyes and walked away, and every careful line I had drawn went comprehensively to pieces." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a small, careful gesture, and then his hand stayed at her jaw and she let it. "I am in love with you," he said, with the same direct honesty he applied to everything. "I understand that is abrupt. I understand we have known each other 3 weeks under circumstances that were not exactly peaceful. I understand if that requires more time and more ordinary circumstances before you can even know how you feel in response." She looked at him. She thought about the care he took. She thought about every small, consistent thing, the nod through the window, the envelope left on the desk, the way he had ridden his horse into the road. She thought about his hand closing around hers at the table. "It doesn't require more time," she said. "I have been doing sums, Flynn, and the sum has been adding up to the same answer for about 2 weeks. I was just waiting for the professional circumstances to finish being complicated." He looked at her with that slight shift around his eyes that she now recognized as the expression he made when he was feeling something strongly and was restraining himself from showing the full extent of it. "They're finished now," she said. He kissed her. It was a careful, deliberate kiss, the first one, with one hand still at her jaw and the other at her waist, and it tasted like morning air and the ending of things held back too long. She kissed him back with the direct, wholehearted commitment that she had told him she applied to everything, and she felt him draw her closer with a sharp intake of breath, and the flat Texas morning opened up around them both. They stayed there, a mile south of Caldwell, for a long time. The months that followed were not simple. No part of Rosa Vane's life had ever been simple, and she was not the kind of woman to expect that love would change that particular pattern. But they were the kind of months that build something real. Marshal Haynes conducted a thorough investigation of the Drummond operation, and Rosa provided formal testimony that she gave with the same precision and thoroughness that had impressed Flynn from the beginning. The evidence was overwhelming. Silas Drummond was convicted on 6 counts of financial fraud and 2 counts of attempted witness intimidation and arson conspiracy, and he was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary. Cutter received 7 years. The 2 clerks were sentenced to shorter terms in exchange for their full cooperation. The financial recovery process for the affected ranching families was slow, as these things are, but it was real. The Riley family received a legal settlement that allowed them to clear their debts and retain their land. Rosa received formal recognition from the circuit judge's office as an instrumental party in the investigation. The first time, the judge's clerk told her somewhat awkwardly that such recognition had been issued to a woman acting in a civilian capacity in that district. Flynn had framed the letter. She had found it on the wall of his office one morning and had stood looking at it for a moment, and then looked at him where he was sitting at his desk with an expression that was trying not to be pleased with itself and failing. "Take it down," she said. "It's embarrassing." "It's not embarrassing. It's the most impressive document in this office, including my own commission. Flynn." "It stays," he said, and went back to his report. She left it on the wall. As for staying, she did stay. Not in the room above the jailhouse, which was restored to its original purpose once the professional necessity had passed. Flynn had spoken to the proprietor of a small property on the western edge of Main Street, a cottage that had been used as a rental for the previous occupant and was currently empty. Rosa had inspected it with the pragmatic thoroughness she applied to all decisions, checked the roof, the window seals, the condition of the small kitchen stove, and had declared it suitable. Flynn had helped her carry her trunk over from the jailhouse and had set it down in the middle of the small front room and looked around at the empty space with an expression she read very clearly. "This is my house," she said. "I know," he said. "You are welcome to visit it regularly." "I appreciate that. You are welcome to stay for dinner when you are invited. That's very kind." "But this is my house," she said. And she said it the way she said everything, with full meaning behind it, and with the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned that owning the space she occupied was something she had earned. "It is your house," he said, with complete sincerity. "I wouldn't have it any other way." She believed him. That, she had discovered over the preceding months, was the particular gift of Flynn Bartlett. He meant what he said, completely and always, and she had stopped being surprised by it, and had started simply receiving it as the solid, reliable fact it was. They courted properly over the spring and summer, properly in the Texas Ranger sense, which meant that Flynn took Sunday afternoon meals with her, and they walked together in the evenings along the southern fence line, and he brought her books from the small lending library that the Methodist Church maintained, and she told him which books were worth reading and which were not, and they had long, absorbed arguments about this that both of them enjoyed. He met her at her cottage one evening in late August with something in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of gathered intention, a particular quality of focus that she recognized immediately as the look of a man who has made a decision and is about to act on it. He sat down across from her at her small table. "I have something to say," he said. She folded her hands. "I'm listening." "I want to marry you," he said. Not a question. He knew her well enough to know that what she needed from him was directness, not uncertainty. "I want you to be my wife. I want to share whatever this life is with you, all of it, the cattle town and the difficult work and the long flat evenings and the bad winters and the good ones. I want to wake up in the morning and know you're there." He paused. I've been thinking about how to say this correctly for approximately 4 months. She looked at him across the small table in her small cottage with the late August light coming through the window. She thought about everything that had happened in the 6 months since she had stepped off a coach with a carpet bag and a letter of introduction. She thought about her father, who had been precise and honest, and what he would think of this man. "Yes," she said. Flynn Bartlett let out a breath, a long, slow breath, as if he had been holding it for a very long time. And then he smiled, and it was the most unguarded expression she had ever seen from him. Open and warm and entirely unmanaged, the smile of a man who has been very careful for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. She reached across the table and took his hand. They were married in October 1882 at the small Baptist church on the north end of Main Street, which was the only church in Caldwell. The minister, a patient, round-faced man named Pastor Ellis, presided over a ceremony that was attended by a surprising proportion of the town, including the Riley family, who came in from their ranch in a wagon decorated with wildflowers by the youngest grandchildren, and who embraced Rosa before the service with the particular warmth of people who know they owe someone something important and have decided the best way to express it is simply with presents. Rosa wore the dress she had bought in San Antonio the previous year with the last of her savings, a deep blue wool that she had never worn because there had never been an occasion appropriate enough. She had done her hair herself, and she had carried a small bunch of yellow wildflowers that one of the Riley grandchildren had pressed into her hands outside the church, and she had walked down the aisle in her own small church with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes on the man standing at the front of it. Flynn watched her walk toward him with an expression that he made no attempt to control, and it was the expression she would remember for the rest of her life, the absolute, unconcealed evidence of a man who considered himself extraordinarily fortunate and knew it. The ceremony was short and sincere. They said their vows with the direct, specific seriousness that both of them brought to things that mattered, and Pastor Ellis pronounced them married in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the small church, and Flynn kissed her with considerably more warmth than the occasion typically demanded, and someone in the back pews, she was fairly certain it was one of the Riley adult children, made a sound of approval. They had a small supper at the hotel, which had undergone a change of management in the aftermath of the Drummond case, and was now operated by a woman named Mrs. Garfield, who had strong opinions about proper hospitality. The food was good, and the company was warm, and Rosa sat beside her husband and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a deep, uncomplicated rightness, the sensation of having arrived somewhere after a journey that had been longer and harder than she had planned. Flynn leaned close at one point during the supper and said very quietly, "You're happy?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Good," he said. He said it the way he said everything, simply and with complete sincerity. He reached over and briefly covered her hand with his. "So am I." Life in Caldwell settled into a shape she had not imagined for herself but recognized when she was in it as exactly right. She continued her accounting work, not for a single employer now, but for a small set of local businesses and ranches who had heard about the Drummond case and were looking for someone honest and thorough to manage their books. She worked from an office she established in the front room of the cottage, with a proper desk and a filing system she had designed herself, and the work was both sufficiently interesting and sufficiently well compensated to give her the financial independence she had never stopped valuing. Flynn continued his ranger duties, which meant long days and occasionally longer nights and stretches of time when he rode out on patrol, and she did not hear from him for a day or two. She had gone into the marriage knowing this, and she accepted it with the practical honesty of a woman who understood that the work he did was part of who he was, the same way that her insistence on financial independence was part of who she was. They had talked about it, clearly and directly, before the wedding and again after, until they had arrived at a mutual understanding that felt solid. But when he came home fully, not distracted or carrying his work with him in the way of men who cannot separate their professional and personal selves. When he walked through the door of their house, he was present, and she understood that this was its own particular gift. She learned that he made coffee badly and always had, and that he had accepted this about himself with the equanimity of a man who has identified his limitations, and that he was genuinely delighted when she made coffee instead, because it was so significantly better. She learned that he read slowly and with total absorption, and that he preferred histories to novels, but would read a novel if she recommended it with sufficient conviction. She learned that he woke before dawn from habit and could not reliably return to sleep, and that he used this time to sit on the small porch at the back of the house and watch the sky lighten, and that this was the time of day he thought most clearly. She started waking early herself, not always, but some mornings, and bringing coffee out to the porch, and they would sit together in the pre-dawn quiet and watch the Texas sky come alive with color and not say anything at all, which was its own kind of conversation. He learned things about her too. He learned that she organized her thinking in numbers, that when she was upset or anxious, she would work through accounting problems as a calming mechanism, that she had a genuine fear of large dogs that she managed with dignity, and a slight but noticeable increase in walking pace. He learned that she had her father's gift for precision, but also her father's stubborn streak, the conviction that a thing done incorrectly was not a thing worth doing, and that this could occasionally make her own life more difficult than necessary. He learned that she cried at specific, unpredictable things: a piece of music, a letter from a friend in San Antonio, once a particularly arresting sunset, and that she was both embarrassed and defiant about the fact that she cried, which he found so entirely characteristic of her that it made him love her more. The winter of their first year of marriage was the kind of winter that tests whether two people are genuinely suited to close quarters. Texas winters in the Comanche County area were not the severe, snowbound variety, but they were cold and gray and long, and the short days and restricted movement put pressure on patience. They had arguments. They were honest arguments, the kind where both people say clearly what they mean, and they were followed by conversations of equal honesty that arrived at genuine resolutions, and they made both of them understand that the other person could be disagreed with and disagreed back at, without the whole thing collapsing. There was one argument in January of their first winter that Rosa thought about long afterward as the one that mattered most. It had started over something small, a professional matter, her accounting work, the question of whether she should take on a particular new client who Flynn had some professional misgivings about. The surface dispute was about the client. The actual dispute, which they arrived at eventually after some plain speaking on both sides, was about autonomy. "I understand your concern," she had said, seated at her desk in the front room with her arms folded. "And I appreciate that it comes from a legitimate professional knowledge that I do not have. But I need you to understand that this is my work and my decision, and if I make the wrong call, it is my wrong call to make." He had stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I hear you," he had said. And then, after a pause that she recognized as him actually thinking rather than formulating, "You're right. I overstated it. Your professional judgment is your own." She had looked at him. "You're not going to argue. You made a correct point," he said. I try not to argue with correct points out of pride." She had looked at him for another moment, then she had turned back to her desk. "Sit down," she had said. "I want to tell you about the client. The actual concern, not the version where I've already decided. I want your honest read." He had sat down. They had talked through it. The client turned out, on genuine review, to have circumstances that Rosa decided made him unsuitable. The same conclusion Flynn had reached, but arrived at through Rosa's own analysis rather than his recommendation, which made all the difference. Afterward, Flynn had said, with that slight expression that was his version of amusement, "We arrived at the same place." "We arrived at the same place through the correct process," she had corrected him. "That's the part that matters." He had looked at her with those steady dark eyes and something in them that was pure, undefended love. "You're remarkable," he said. She had not been able to do much about the warmth that moved through her when he said it. "I know," she said, and made him laugh. Spring came back to the Texas plains in the particular explosive way of grassland springs. Sudden, extravagant, the bleached winter earth going green almost overnight, wildflowers appearing along the fence lines and road edges, the sky returning to its summer depth. Rosa noticed all of it with more attention than she had the previous spring, which she attributed to the general shift in perspective that comes from settling into a life rather than trying to survive it. She was also, by April, fairly certain that her domestic situation was about to become more complicated in the most significant way possible. She told Flynn on a Wednesday evening in April, at the kitchen table after supper, with the practical directness that was her natural mode. "I believe we're going to have a child," she said. He had gone very still across the table from her. "In October, I think," she said. "Maybe November, I've been calculating." He was still looking at her with that stillness that was not blankness. It was the look of a man taking in something large. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," she said. "Tired, occasionally nauseous in the mornings, nothing I can't manage." He reached across the table, the same gesture, the gesture he had made the first time they had held hands, and he took her hand in both of his. "Rosa," he said. "Thank you," he said finally, very quietly. "That's a strange thing to say," she told him, but gently. "I don't know what else to say," he admitted. This is—" He stopped. He pressed her hand to his lips briefly with a quiet tenderness that she felt in her chest. "I'm going to be a terrible worrier. You should know that now." "I am aware of your tendencies," she said. "I will manage you." He looked at her over their joined hands with that expression, the open, unmanaged one, the one he reserved for moments of real feeling. "I know you will," he said. The summer of 1883 was long and hot and busy in the way that Caldwell summers were. The cattle drives pushing through on their last runs before the industry began its slow shift away from the open trail system. The town alive with the particular energy of a place that knew its character was changing and had not yet decided what to become next. Flynn's work was busy. The end of the trail era was bringing its own complications, land disputes and economic tensions, and the occasional violence of men whose livelihoods were shifting under their feet. Rosa worked through the summer at her own pace, managing her accounting clients with the adjustments necessitated by her condition, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had no intention of treating pregnancy as an incapacitation. She had organized her office so that she could work from the comfort of the house, and she had hired a young woman named Addie to assist with the heavier physical aspects of the domestic work, not because she could not do it, but because Flynn had asked her to with such earnest concern that she had decided to let him have this particular management decision without argument. Addie was 19 years old and the daughter of one of the Riley ranching family's sons, a small, bright-eyed young woman who worked with cheerful efficiency, and who Rosa found she genuinely liked. They talked while they worked, about the town and the changes coming and the wider world, and it reminded Rosa of something she had not had since leaving San Antonio: easy female company. She also had, increasingly, the company of the rest of Caldwell. The town had gone through a real shift in the year since the Drummond case. Not a miraculous transformation, because small towns do not transform miraculously, but a genuine adjustment. The people whose accounts had been defrauded had been compensated, and the knowledge that the deception had been operating for years created a collective wariness about the next concentrated economic power, and a corresponding appreciation for the woman who had documented the fraud carefully enough to make the case stick. Rosa was not beloved in the way of people who make themselves universally accommodating, but she was respected, which was what she had always wanted. She was also, she discovered, being consulted. People came to her, not just for accounting, but for the kind of clear-eyed practical analysis that good financial thinking requires. Ranching families asking whether a proposed land deal was sound. The hotel under Mrs. Garfield's new management asking for an assessment of whether their expansion plans were viable. The Baptist Church Committee needing someone to look over the building fund accounts. She did this work with the same precision she applied to everything, and she charged fair rates for it, and she built something that she had not known she was building until it was already built, a professional reputation that was entirely her own. In November 1883, they had their first child. A boy, born in the early morning hours of a cold November day with the wind outside, and a midwife named Mrs. Carver, who had delivered approximately half the children in Comanche County, and had the calm authority of someone who has done something important enough times that panic is simply not a useful response. Flynn was in the house the entire time, which was not the usual practice. Most husbands were sent elsewhere during the proceedings. But Rosa had said simply that she would like him there, and Mrs. Carver had assessed Flynn Bartlett with the experienced eye of a woman who knew men and had said, "He'll do," and let him stay. He held her hand for most of it and was, as he had predicted, a terrible worrier, but he managed his worrying quietly enough that it did not add to her difficulties. And when their son arrived, small and red and furious at the world in the way of healthy newborns, Rosa saw Flynn's face do something she had never seen it do before. It went completely undone. Every layer of the careful, steady composure that she loved in him dissolved entirely. And what was underneath, it was so vast and undefended that she had to look away for a moment to give him the privacy of it. He held the boy, wrapped in the wool blanket Mrs. Carver had prepared, with the extreme care of a man who does not trust himself not to break something irreplaceable. The baby stared up at him with the unfocused intensity of the very newly born. "Hello," Flynn said quietly. "I've been waiting for you." Rosa lay back against the pillow and felt the exhaustion of the hours settle into her bones. And beneath it, something that was so profoundly right and complete that she let herself stop thinking about anything at all for a little while, and simply be in the room in this moment, in this life. They named him Thomas James Bartlett. Thomas for Flynn's younger brother who still lived near San Marcos, and James for Rosa's father, which had been Rosa's suggestion and which Flynn had accepted immediately and without the hesitation that would have made it a compromise rather than a choice. Thomas James was a serious baby who turned into a serious toddler, who turned into a small, watchful child, who seemed to have inherited both his mother's precision and his father's steady temperament, and combined them into something entirely his own. He had Flynn's dark eyes and Rosa's tendency to solve problems by thinking about them very carefully before touching them. And he had the additional characteristic of being capable of sitting in one place for surprisingly long periods observing something that interested him, which Rosa recognized as a kind of intelligence, and Flynn recognized as a kind of patience he wished he had shown more of at that age. The years arranged themselves as years do when you are living inside them, full, ongoing, changing in the slow cumulative way rather than the dramatic sudden way. Caldwell changed around them. The cattle trail era wound down, as it had been winding down, and the town found new economic footing in agricultural supply and rail connection. The railway reached Caldwell in 1885, which changed the nature of the place significantly, bringing with it a new influx of people and commerce and the particular pressures of expansion. Flynn's ranger work evolved with the times. The large-scale cattle operation crimes that had defined his first years in Caldwell shifted toward the land disputes and railroad-adjacent fraud that came with the territory's next chapter. And he navigated these new complexities with the same thorough, patient approach that had characterized everything he did. Rosa's accounting practice grew with the town. By 1885, she had more clients than she could manage alone and had taken on a second assistant, a young man named Daniel, fresh from a business college in Dallas, who was initially uncertain about working for a woman and then spent 2 weeks watching Rosa conduct a client audit and revised his uncertainty entirely. They had their second child in 1886, a girl this time, born in September in the same room with the same Mrs. Carver presiding, although Mrs. Carver was now in her 70s and had informed Rosa and Flynn during the pregnancy that she intended to retire after this, and that they should plan accordingly for future children. The girl was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter initially, and she arrived with a full head of dark red hair that she appeared to have invented independently, since neither Rosa nor Flynn could account for its origin. They named her Eleanor Mary, and she spent her infancy watching her older brother with a gaze of concentrated interest that suggested she was taking notes and would have opinions about his methods once she had sufficient command of language to express them. Thomas was 3½ when Eleanor arrived and responded to her presence with the grave, proprietorial interest of a firstborn child. Not jealousy, but a careful repositioning of himself as her senior partner in the business of being the Bartlett children, a role he took with genuine seriousness. Flynn came home from a patrol in the first week of Eleanor's life to find Thomas sitting on the floor next to his sister's cradle, explaining something to her in a low, earnest voice, and he stood in the doorway watching this for a long moment before he said anything. When he told Rosa about it that evening, his voice had that particular quality it got when he was feeling something large. He was explaining the layout of the ranch to the north of town, Flynn said, where the fence lines run, in some detail. She was listening, Rosa said. She had watched this too. She's 6 days old. She's paying attention, Rosa said. She's mine, that's what we do. He looked at her over the dinner table with that open, warm expression that had never diminished in the years they had been married. If anything, it had deepened, become quieter and more certain, the way that genuine love does when it has moved past the intensity of beginning and settled into the steady knowledge of itself. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said things, simply, directly, because it was true and he saw no reason to be indirect about things that were true. "I love you," she said in the same direct way. "Eat your supper before it's cold." He ate his supper. Eleanor slept in her cradle. Thomas fell asleep on the rug in the front room where he had been sitting with his blocks, and Flynn carried him to bed with the careful gentleness that was so characteristic of him. And when he came back, Rosa was at her desk, reviewing a set of figures that needed to be finalized by morning, and he stood behind her chair for a moment and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly against his presence. "Come to bed when you're done," he said. 30 minutes, she said. 20, he said. 25, she said. She heard the sound that was his version of a laugh. He went to bed. She finished her figures in 23 minutes, which she considered a satisfying outcome. In 1887, Mrs. Carver announced her retirement formally at a church gathering, and the town of Caldwell organized a dinner in her honor that Rosa helped plan, and for which she baked a pecan cake that Mrs. Carver declared the best thing she had eaten in recent memory. At the dinner, in the warm October evening with the hall full of people whose children and grandchildren Mrs. She thought about Silas Drummond, who was 5 years into his 12-year sentence. She thought about the woman who had arrived in this town afraid and determined and alone. She thought about the road south of town, and the chestnut horse, and the badge catching the afternoon light, and the 4 words that had changed the direction of everything. She is not leaving this town. She had not left this town. Not because she had been made to stay. Not because she had been blocked or forced or given no choice. She had stayed because she had chosen it. Chosen it on the road that day. Chosen it at the table with Flynn's hand over hers. Chosen it every morning since. Chosen it again and again with the same deliberate, knowing commitment she brought to everything that mattered. She turned to look at her husband beside her. He was half listening to the story Mr. Riley was telling about the first time Mrs. Carver had delivered a baby at the Riley Ranch 20 years ago, and there was a slight curve at his mouth that she recognized as the expression he wore when he was genuinely enjoying himself without calling attention to the fact. Thomas had fallen fully asleep against his side, and Flynn's arm was around him with the automatic, total ease of a man who has completely and permanently accommodated the presence of children into his sense of himself. He turned and found her looking at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He held her gaze for a moment. He understood exactly what she meant by it. She knew he did, because he understood most of what she meant always, and this had never stopped being extraordinary to her. He reached over and briefly covered her free hand where it rested on the table. "I know," he said quietly. "I know, Mrs. Carver's dinner ended late, and they walked home through the October night with Thomas carried in Flynn's arms, and Alina walked between them holding both their hands, the 4 of them moving down the main street of Caldwell under a sky that was dense with stars the way only the wide, flat sky of central Texas can be, vast and indifferent and magnificent. Alina stopped in the middle of the street and looked up, which meant they all stopped. "Why are there so many?" she asked, with the focused curiosity that had been characteristic of her from approximately the moment she could speak. "Because the sky is very large," Rosa said. Alina considered this. "Is it as large as the distance to the Riley Ranch?" "Much larger," Flynn said. Alina looked at the sky for another long moment. "Good," she said with apparent satisfaction and resumed walking. Flynn caught Rosa's eye over their daughter's head, and she saw that expression, the completely open one, the one he saved for the moments that mattered most. She squeezed Alina's small hand. They walked home through the October dark, and the stars were very bright, and the night was quiet in the way that the best nights are quiet, not empty, but full of everything that had been built here between them, full of everything that was still to come. 3 years later, in 1890, they had a 3rd child, another boy, named William after nobody in particular, except that it suited him. And he arrived in the world as different from his siblings as a person can be, loud and extroverted and physically fearless from the moment he figured out that surfaces could be climbed. Where Thomas had been careful and a leaner observant, William was enthusiastic in a way that kept both his parents and his older siblings permanently alert. Thomas, by then a solemn and thoughtful 7-year-old, responded to his younger brother with the patient, affectionate tolerance of someone who has decided that chaos is not personally threatening so long as it remains within certain parameters. Eleanor, at 4, found William fascinating in the same intense, note-taking way she found everything, and spent considerable time following him to observe what would happen next. What usually happened next was that something fell over. Flynn had retired from active Ranger patrol duty the previous year. Not from the Rangers entirely, but from the extended rides that had characterized his first decade of service, which he had concluded, with the practical honesty he applied to all things, that a man with 3 children and a settled life was not the best person to be conducting. He had taken on a supervisory and administrative role for the district, managing the Caldwell station and overseeing the younger Rangers assigned to the territory, which suited his thoroughness and his talent for building cases based on careful, complete documentation. He was good at it. He was good at developing the younger Rangers, at teaching the particular combination of patience and directness that made law enforcement in difficult circumstances something other than brute force. He had, Rosa observed over the years, never entirely resolved the tension between the injustices he could do something about and the ones he could only document, the systematic, structural inequities that moved too slowly for law enforcement to address. But he had learned to apply his energy where it could be most effective, and he had learned to say, clearly and without evasion, when he thought a thing was wrong even if he could not personally fix it. Rosa's accounting practice had become, by 1890, something she had started to think of as a small business rather than a practice. She had 2 assistants now, and a proper office space she rented on the east side of Main Street, a set of clients that ranged from individual ranching families to the town's new general commercial enterprises, and a reputation in the surrounding territory that sent people to her from as far as 30 miles away. She had also, at the suggestion of the Methodist minister's wife who had taken adult education seriously, begun to teach a monthly bookkeeping class at the church hall for women in the community who wanted to understand their own finances better. This last thing was the one that surprised her most with how much it mattered to her. She had not expected the teaching. It was not something she had sought out deliberately. But standing in front of a room of women of various ages and showing them how numbers told the truth about their financial situations, watching the particular expression that crossed people's faces when they understood for the first time that the information they needed to make good decisions had been available all along. She recognized this as the thing her father had given her that she most wanted to pass on. Flynn came to the class once quietly, sitting in the back, and she had seen him there when she turned from the board, and had given him a look that communicated both her appreciation and her awareness that he would hear about it fully at home. He had left at the break with the slight, barely managed expression of a man who has been caught doing something sentimental and is not going to apologize for it. 30 women in there, he said that evening. I counted. 32, she corrected him. 32 women who understand their own accounts better because of you. That's the goal, she said. He looked at her. Your father would have been proud of you. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm around them, supper things cleared, the children's voices audible from the front room where Thomas was presumably keeping William from climbing something inadvisable. I think so, she said. I hope so. He raised you, Flynn said. Of course he would. She reached over and touched his face briefly, just the brush of her fingers at his jaw, the same gesture he had made to her on that long-ago morning in the field south of town. He caught her hand and held it. The years of the 1890s opened in front of them. The world changing, the cattle era entirely over now, the railroad bringing a different Texas into being, the town of Caldwell shifting into something new and somewhat uncertain, the big sky above the flat land remaining exactly as it had always been and probably always would. Thomas grew into a young man who studied law in Dallas and came back to Caldwell with his education and his father's steady eyes and his mother's precision. And he set up a small legal practice on Main Street and handled land disputes and contract matters with a thoroughness that made the circuit judge say, privately, to Flynn, that Rosa and Flynn's son had the makings of one of the better legal minds in the territory. And Rosa and Flynn grew older together in the gradual, cumulative way that two people who have chosen each other entirely do, not diminishing, but deepening. The morning coffee on the back porch became a ritual that neither of them would have willingly sacrificed. The long evenings with their separate reading and their occasional, absorbed arguments about what they were reading. The Sunday dinners when the children came, and eventually the grandchildren, filling the house with the beautiful, exhausting noise of family continuing itself. On an evening in the autumn of their 10th year of marriage, sitting on the back porch with the October sky going deep blue above them and the last of the summer warmth still in the air, Flynn said, "Do you ever think about the road?" She looked at him. "The afternoon you stepped off the wagon," he said. "I think about it sometimes. I think about what would have happened if I'd been 5 minutes later getting back from the North Patrol. Then I would have been on the coach to Wichita Falls," she said. "Yes. And you would have eventually tracked me down because the case required a witness." "Probably," he said, "although it might have taken time." She considered this. "I think about the stairs," she said. He looked at her. "That first morning," she said, "when I nearly walked into you. I almost told you everything right then. I had the notebook in my hand. I was this close to opening it." "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid," she said. "And because I was looking at you, and you were looking at me. And I thought that if I told you everything while I was standing that close to you, it was going to be very difficult to maintain any kind of appropriate professional boundary afterward." He was quiet beside her for a moment. "You thought that? On the stairs? You have very disconcerting eyes," she said. He made that sound, the one that was his version of a laugh. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture, the same warm closure of his fingers around hers that he had made at the table, on the path, on their wedding day, every day since. "I'm glad you stepped off the wagon," he said. She looked at the darkening sky, at the stars beginning to appear in the east, at the vast Texas night opening up above them. "I'm glad you blocked the road," she said. They sat there together in the quiet autumn evening, holding hands on the porch of the house they had built into a home, with the sounds of their life around them and the sky above them, and everything they had made between them present and whole and continuing. Not a completed thing, but a living thing, which is the only kind of good ending there is.